The thunder rumbled across the Montana sky as Matthew O'Connor took shelter in the old wooden stable, his clothes soaked from the sudden downpour that had interrupted his long ride back to town. The year was 1876, and the untamed frontier had little mercy for a man caught unprepared by nature's fury. The stable was dimly lit, with only thin slivers of gray light filtering through the cracks between weathered boards. Matthew removed his dripping hat and ran a hand through his dark, rain-slicked hair. His eyes, the color of weathered denim, scanned the shadows as he led his exhausted chestnut stallion, Rusty, into an empty stall. "Easy there, boy," he murmured, his voice low and rough from too many nights around campfires, too many days riding through dust. At 28, Matthew had already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences, from fighting in the latter days of the Civil War to driving cattle across 3 states. He settled on a wooden crate in the corner, pulling off his boots to empty them of rainwater. The stable smelled of hay, horse, and wet earth, familiar and somehow comforting. Outside, the rain continued its assault, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Matthew didn't hear her enter. The creak of the stable door had been masked by a particularly loud crack of thunder. It wasn't until his horse nickered softly that he realized he was no longer alone. She stood in the entrance, a slender figure silhouetted against the gray light of the stormy afternoon. Water dripped from the edges of her cloak as she pushed back the hood, revealing a face that seemed to catch what little light existed in the dim stable. Violet Thornton moved with purpose, seemingly unaware or unconcerned by Matthew's presence. In her hands she carried a small burlap sack. She approached the stall next to Matthew's, where an aging palomino stood with its head hanging low. "Hello, Buttercup," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. She reached into the sack and produced an apple, which she offered to the horse with an open palm. Matthew watched in silence, not wanting to startle her. There was something mesmerizing about the quiet confidence of her movements, the gentle way she stroked the palomino's nose as it took the treat from her hand. "You're welcome to wait out the storm," he finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Though I reckon it'll be a while." She turned quickly, her hand instinctively drawing close to her chest. Her eyes, a deep green that reminded Matthew of pine forests, widened slightly. "I didn't see you there," she said, recovering her composure quickly. "I thought the stable was empty." "Just me and Rusty," Matthew replied, nodding toward his horse. "Got caught in the downpour about 3 miles out." The woman Violet nodded but kept her distance. Matthew noticed a wariness in her stance, the subtle way she positioned herself near the door. In these parts, caution wasn't just wise, it was necessary. "You must be passing through," she said, more statement than question. "I know most folks in Silver Creek." "Just arrived yesterday," Matthew confirmed. "Planning to stay a while, though. Might be some work at the Henderson ranch." Violet's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Henderson's," she repeated, a new edge to her voice. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face fully for the first time. Matthew was struck by the quiet strength in her features' high cheekbones, a determined chin, and those remarkable eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "You know the place?" he asked. "Everyone knows Henderson's," she answered cryptically. She turned back to Buttercup, producing another apple from her sack. "This old girl belonged to my father," she explained, changing the subject. "Can't keep her at our place anymore, so she stays here." Matthew nodded, understanding there was something unspoken in her words. "She seems fond of you." A small smile touched Violet's lips. "We've been through a lot together." She stroked the palomino's neck with genuine affection. "Haven't we, girl?" The silence that fell between them was surprisingly comfortable, punctuated only by the steady drum of rain and occasional rumble of distant thunder. Matthew found himself studying her profile, the way she seemed both fragile and resilient at once. "I'm Matthew O'Connor," he offered finally. She hesitated before answering. Violet Thornton. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Thornton, he said, the formality feeling somehow necessary. Just Violet, she corrected him, then added, You said you're looking for work at Henderson's? Matthew nodded. Word is he's expanding his operation, needs experienced hands. Violet seemed to be weighing something in her mind. Mr. Henderson isn't known for his fair treatment of workers, she said carefully. Or neighbors. Before Matthew could ask what she meant, the stable door swung open again. A burly man in a slicker stepped inside, water cascading off his hat and coat. Violet, he called, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of authority. Your mother's looking for you. Storm's getting worse. I'm coming, Frank, she replied. She gave Buttercup one last pat before turning to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at Matthew. Be careful who you work for, Mr. O'Connor, she said quietly. Some opportunities cost more than they're worth. With that enigmatic warning, she was gone, disappearing into the gray curtain of rain with the man called Frank. Matthew stared after her, suddenly finding the stable much emptier than before. The rain continued well into the evening, keeping Matthew confined to the stable. He made himself as comfortable as possible, using his saddle as a pillow and his duster as a blanket. His thoughts kept returning to Violet Thornton and her cryptic warning about Henderson. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Matthew rode into Silver Creek, a modest frontier town with the usual collection of buildings: general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a small church at the far end of the main street. People were already about their business, repairing minor damage from the storm or simply enjoying the fresh, washed air. He stabled Rusty at the livery and made his way to the saloon, figuring it was the best place to learn more about Henderson and possibly more about the intriguing Violet Thornton. The Silver Dollar Saloon was quiet at this hour, with only a few patrons nursing morning drinks or picking at plates of eggs and bacon. Matthew approached the bar where a middle-aged man with impressive mutton chops was polishing glasses. Coffee, if you've got it, Matthew said, sliding onto a stool. Coming up, the barkeep replied, pouring a steaming cup from a pot on the stove behind him. New face in town. Passing through? Thinking of staying a while. Name's Matthew O'Connor. Sam Wilson, the barkeep introduced himself. What brings you to Silver Creek, Mr. O'Connor? Looking for work. Heard Henderson might be hiring. Sam's hands paused momentarily in their polishing. Henderson, eh? Well, he's always looking for men who know their way around cattle and aren't afraid of hard work. He leaned in slightly. Or a hard boss. Second time I've heard something like that, Matthew remarked. Met a woman yesterday who seemed to have similar thoughts. Oh? Who might that be? Violet Thornton. Sam nodded knowingly. Ah, well, the Thorntons have their reasons to be wary of Henderson. Most folks around here do, truth be told. What kind of reasons? Sam glanced around before answering. Henderson's got the biggest spread in the county, and he's not particular about how he expands it. The Thornton place is small, but sits on good land with reliable water. Henderson's been trying to get his hands on it for years. Matthew sipped his coffee, considering this information. And the Thorntons won't sell? Old man Thornton wouldn't hear of it. That land's been in their family since before the war. When he passed last winter, Henderson figured Mrs. Thornton and Violet would be easy to pressure. Sam shook his head. He didn't count on Violet being as stubborn as her father. The saloon doors swung open, and Matthew turned to see three men enter. They wore dusty riding clothes and had the hard look of ranch hands. The tallest of them, a man with a scar running along his jawline, surveyed the room with cold eyes. Speaking of Henderson, Sam muttered, those would be some of his boys. The men approached the bar, taking positions a few stools down from Matthew. The scarred man ordered whiskey for all three. Early for that, isn't it, Reeves? Sam commented as he poured. Not when you've been riding since dawn, Reeves answered. He noticed Matthew and gave him an appraising look. Don't recognize you. New in town? Matthew nodded. Just arrived. Looking for work? Might be. Reeves downed his whiskey and set the glass down with a thunk. Henderson's hiring. Good pay for men who understand loyalty. The emphasis on the last word wasn't subtle. Matthew merely nodded again. I'll keep that in mind. The men finished their drinks and left, but not before Reeves gave Matthew another calculating look. When the door closed behind them, Sam leaned in again. Word of advice, he said quietly. Henderson pays well, but he expects his men to do whatever he asks. No questions. Some of what he asks. Sam trailed off, shaking his head. Matthew finished his coffee, his mind made up. Where can I find the Thornton place? Sam looked surprised. You thinking of calling on Violet? That'll set tongues wagging. Just want to get both sides of the story before I make any decisions, Matthew replied, though he knew there was more to it than that. The memory of Violet's green eyes and quiet strength had stayed with him. Follow the east road out of town for about 2 miles. Small farmhouse with a red barn. Can't miss it. Sam paused. But I'd watch yourself. Henderson doesn't take kindly to folks interfering in what he considers his business. Matthew tipped his hat in thanks and left the saloon, feeling the weight of curious eyes on his back. Silver Creek was beginning to seem a lot more complicated than he'd anticipated. The Thornton farm was indeed small but well kept. A modest 2-story farmhouse stood surrounded by fields of wheat that swayed gently in the breeze. The red barn Sam had mentioned sat to the east of the house, with a chicken coop and vegetable garden nearby. As Matthew approached on horseback, he saw Violet in the garden, kneeling among rows of plants with a basket beside her. She wore a simple blue dress and had her hair tied back with a ribbon. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, her hand shading her eyes against the sun. Recognition dawned on her face as he drew closer, followed by evident surprise. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt as he dismounted. "Mr. O'Connor," she said, "this is unexpected." "Hope I'm not intruding," Matthew replied, feeling suddenly unsure of his decision to come. "That depends on why you're here," Violet said, her direct manner unchanged from their first meeting. "Wanted to talk more about what you said yesterday. About Henderson." A shadow crossed her face. "I shouldn't have said anything. It's not your concern." "Maybe not," Matthew admitted. "But I make it a point to know who I'm working for." Before Violet could respond, the farmhouse door opened and an older woman appeared on the porch. Her resemblance to Violet was unmistakable, though her hair was streaked with gray and lines of worry framed her eyes. "Violet, who's visiting?" she called. "It's all right, Mother," Violet answered. "This is Mr. O'Connor. He's new in town." Mrs. Thornton approached, studying Matthew with curious but wary eyes. "Any friend of Violet's is welcome here," she said, though her tone suggested some reservation. "Matthew O'Connor, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "I met your daughter during yesterday's storm." "Well, Mr. O'Connor, you've come a fair distance. The least we can offer is some refreshment. Violet, why don't you bring our guest around to the porch where it's cooler?" Despite Violet's obvious reluctance, Matthew soon found himself seated on the Thorntons' front porch with a glass of lemonade in hand. Mrs. Thornton excused herself to attend to some baking, leaving Matthew alone with Violet. "You still haven't said why you really came?" Violet said, breaking the silence. "I heard things in town," Matthew admitted. "About Henderson and your family." Violet's expression tightened. "People talk too much. Sometimes talk is worth listening to." Matthew leaned forward. "Sam at the saloon says Henderson's been pressuring you to sell. That true?" For a moment, Violet seemed ready to dismiss his question, but something in his earnest gaze appeared to change her mind. "Yes," she said finally. Ever since father died, he's been relentless. First with offers well below what the land is worth, then with threats hardly disguised as business propositions. She looked out across the fields, her expression a mixture of determination and worry. This land is all we have. It's our home and our livelihood. What kind of threats? Violet hesitated. Nothing direct enough to take to the sheriff. Cattle breaking through our fences, water from the creek mysteriously diverted, men riding too close to the house at night. She met his eyes. You seem like a decent man, Mr. O'Connor. Don't get mixed up with Henderson. Matthew nodded slowly. I appreciate the warning. He paused, then added, and it's Matthew, if you don't mind. A small smile touched her lips. Matthew, then. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Violet stood quickly, her body tensing as 4 horsemen came into view on the road. Matthew recognized Reeves among them. Henderson's men, Violet said, her voice tight. You should go. I'll stay, Matthew replied, standing beside her. The riders stopped at the edge of the property. Reeves called out, Afternoon, Miss Thornton. Mr. Henderson sent us to check on that fence line we discussed. We've discussed nothing, Mr. Reeves, Violet called back. And you're not welcome on this property. Reeves smirked. Now, that's not very neighborly. Mr. Henderson is concerned about the poor condition of the fencing between our properties. He's offering to have us fix it for you. Our fences are fine, Violet replied coldly. Please leave. The men made no move to depart. Instead, Reeves's gaze shifted to Matthew. Well, look who it is. Decided against Henderson's offer already, have you? Never decided on it to begin with, Matthew answered evenly. Shame, Reeves said. Mr. Henderson doesn't take kindly to folks who choose the wrong side. His eyes moved meaningfully between Matthew and Violet, especially those who meddle in his business. The threat hung in the air, clear as the blue sky above them. Matthew took a step forward. I think you men have delivered your message. Time to move on. For a tense moment, Reeves seemed to consider pushing the confrontation further. Then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. We'll be seeing you both again real soon. With that, he turned his horse, and the men rode away. When they were out of sight, Violet let out a breath she'd been holding. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Now you're involved. Maybe I want to be involved, Matthew replied, surprising himself with the realization that it was true. Violet looked at him with an unreadable expression. Why would you risk making an enemy of the most powerful man in the county for people you barely know? Matthew considered the question. I've spent most of my life drifting, taking whatever work came along without much thought to who was giving the orders, he said slowly. After a while, that starts to wear on a man's soul. He met her gaze. Sometimes you need to stand for something. Or someone. The look that passed between them lasted only a moment, but something significant shifted in that brief connection. Violet's guardedness seemed to soften, just slightly. Mother and I can use some help with the Northfield tomorrow, she said finally, if you're interested in work that doesn't involve Henderson. Matthew smiled. I'll be here at first light. True to his word, Matthew arrived at the Thornton farm as the sun was just peeking over the horizon. The day was spent mending fences, tending to the wheat fields, and repairing a leak in the barn roof. By sunset, he was exhausted but satisfied in a way he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, Matthew became a regular fixture at the Thornton farm. He moved from the hotel in town to a small room above the Thorntons' barn, insisting on paying rent despite Violet and her mother's protests. The arrangement benefited everyone. The women gained a strong pair of hands and protection against Henderson's intimidation, while Matthew found purpose and a place to belong. During those weeks, the connection between Matthew and Violet deepened. They worked side by side during the days, and in the evenings, they often sat on the porch, talking as the stars appeared overhead. Matthew shared stories of his travels across the frontier, while Violet spoke of her dreams to see the farm thrive again as it had during her father's lifetime. One evening, as they finished repairing a broken wagon wheel, Violet asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Why did you really come to Silver Creek, Matthew? It seems like an unlikely place for someone with your experience." Matthew was quiet for a moment, setting down his tools. "I was looking for something," he finally said. "Not sure I knew what until recently." He looked at her, his expression open. "I've been wandering since the war ended. Seen a lot of country, worked a lot of jobs. Nothing ever felt right enough to stay for." "And now?" Violet asked softly. "Now I'm not in any hurry to move on," he replied, holding her gaze. The air between them seemed to still, filled with unspoken feelings. Matthew took a step closer, and Violet didn't back away. Slowly, giving her every chance to retreat, he raised his hand to her cheek. "I think I might have found what I was looking for," he murmured. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily, eyes wide with the sudden realization of how quickly and completely their feelings had developed. "This complicates things," Violet whispered, but she was smiling. "Most worthwhile things do," Matthew replied. Their newfound happiness was short-lived. The very next day, Henderson made his move. Matthew and Violet were working in the field when they spotted a plume of dust on the road, a large group of riders approaching. At their head rode a man Matthew hadn't seen before, but instantly recognized from descriptions: William Henderson himself. Henderson was in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and a beard that did little to hide the hardness of his jaw. He sat tall in the saddle, exuding the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Behind him rode at least a dozen men, including Reeves. "Get your mother and stay in the house," Matthew told Violet urgently. "I'm not hiding," she replied firmly. "Please, Violet, let me talk to him first." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, hurrying toward the house. Matthew walked to the edge of the property, waiting as the riders approached. Henderson reined in his horse a few yards away, studying Matthew with cold calculation. "You must be O'Connor," Henderson said without preamble. "I hear you've declined my employment offer in favor of other opportunities." His gaze flicked toward the farmhouse. "Mr. Henderson," Matthew acknowledged with a nod. "I appreciate the offer, but I've found work that suits me." Playing farmhand to a couple of women too stubborn to recognize a good deal when they see it? Henderson's tone was mocking. "You're wasting your talents, O'Connor, and interfering in business that doesn't concern you." "Seems to me that harassment isn't a legitimate business strategy," Matthew replied evenly. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "I've been patient with the Thornton women, offered them fair compensation for land that they can't possibly maintain on their own. My patience is running out. They're not interested in selling, now or ever." "Everyone has their breaking point," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I suggest you find other employment, O'Connor. Things might get